In this video, we're going to talk about dollar-weighted return. It turns out that dollar-weighted return and internal rate of return are the same thing. However, we usually think of dollar-weighted return as what's known as the simple interest approximation to the internal rate of return. So let's talk about why we might be interested in such a thing through this example. So we've got an investment manager has $100,000 in a fund. A month later, withdraws $10,000 from the fund. In September, beginning of September, deposits $10,000. And at the end of the year, the overall balance was $105,000. So this one asks to find the dollar-weighted return. So if you were actually going to do this using the internal rate of return methods that we've talked about before, we can think about it as a sequence of cash flows again. So if we think about ins and outs, if you will, we laid out $100,000 to start with to put in the fund. A month later, so at time 1/12, we took out $10,000, so that $10,000 would be returned to us, and that's what we considered a positive cash flow. On September 1st, or 8 months later, we put a new $10,000 into the account. So again, that would be a negative cash flow because, again, we took our own money and put it into the account. And then at the very, very end, 1 year later, we could take out $105,000 because that's what's in the account. So we've got negative cash flows of negative $100,000 and negative $10,000. We've got positive cash flows of $10,000 and $105,000. Now, this is not an equation that's easily solvable for I. You can use your cash flow worksheet on your calculator to get this by putting in the appropriate zero cash flows where necessary, and you would need to get a monthly rate and then convert it to an annual effective interest rate. That's what would have to happen here by using your BA2 Plus calculator. Or you could use a computer algebra system or the like and get 5.312% for the interest rate. Now again, this would be a very, very difficult problem to solve by hand. Since these time periods are so short, the simple interest formula is just as good of not as just as good, but it's almost as good of a value as the actual value as far as an approximation goes. So let's see if we can get a simple interest approximation to this interest rate. And this is typically what we call the dollar-weighted return. So the dollar-weighted return usually refers to the simple interest approximation to the internal rate of return. So how do we calculate it? Well, your book defines it as income over fund exposure. So how would you figure out how much income you make? Well, we've got an ending balance and a starting balance. So the difference between that would be just how much that fund would grow. However, we also have to take into account what changes in this final balance. So we took $10,000 out of that account, so we would want to add it back in as far as income goes. We also put $10,000 back into the account, so we want to take it back out as far as that goes. So again, this $105,000 here is affected by a withdrawal that we made and a deposit that we made. Now, these would have opposite signs than perhaps what you would think about it, but again, this $105,000 would have had an extra $10,000 had you not withdrawn that, and this $105,000 has an extra $10,000 because you put in a deposit. So we're adjusting those two transactions. All right, so then how do we consider what's referred to this fund exposure? Well, the $100,000 sat there for an entire year, so we take the $100,000 times the time. The $10,000 that we took out is out of there for 11/12 of the year. So I would subtract 10,000 times 11, 10 to 11/12, because that would be the interest that this piece would earn if I multiply it by the interest rate. This would be the interest that this would earn if it were still sitting in the account, but it's not anymore. So that's why we have that minus 10,000 times 11/12. The last part is we put an extra $10,000 in there, and it sat in there for 4 months out of the year. So that's why we're multiplying it by 4/12. So essentially what we have here with this dollar weighted return is that we're solving for the interest rate. That's why these pieces on the bottom are multiplied by, spread out like they are. Each of these would have an interest rate term on them that's been factored out. That's what we're solving for here. So again, just to reiterate, this sits there the entire year. This $10,000 was taken out after a month, so we lose that much interest over we lose the interest on the $10,000 over the 11/12 of the year. This $10,000 was put in after 8 months, so for 4 months out of the year, we get an extra interest on this $10,000. So that's why these signs are the way they are, and that's where those times are coming from. And if you do this calculation, you get 5.31%, which is really close to the interest rate that we saw above, just by doing this using more advanced approximation techniques up here.